Hello, everyone. Welcome to the series Mud Talks, uncovering the history of medical technology with Professor Vivien Hamilton. My name is Vanessa Chu, Assistant Director in the Office of Alumni and Parent Relations. We thank you for attending today's event. This talk is being recorded and will be distributed after the event. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, and we will try to get through as many questions as possible. I'm going to turn it over to Vivien to introduce herself. Vivien, thanks for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much. All right, let me share my screen. All right, hi everyone. Thanks so much to Vanessa for inviting me to be part of this series, and thanks everyone for showing up on Zoom. I'm excited to share some of my research with you. So I am a professor of history of science here in the HSA department at Harvey Mudd College. And I'm a historian of science, but also a historian of technology and medicine. And for most of my career, I have found myself absolutely fascinated by medical machines of all kinds. And this started in grad school when I met this particularly wonderful object, which is a magneto-electric machine from the mid-19th century. So you can see it's just a small wooden box. And when you open it up, you see this horseshoe magnet and then spools of wire. And if you turn the crank, the handle on the outside, it will rotate the spools of wire beside the magnet and induce a small electric current. And then you can have your patient hold on to the two cylindrical electrodes that are on the outside of the box, and they can receive a small invigorating dose of electricity, which at the time promised to cure all kinds of problems. This one is advertising its use in nervous and other diseases. And electric medicine was so popular in the first half of the 19th century, or sorry, the second half of the 19th century, that electrotherapy institutes sprang up in many cities. This is one in Toronto from the 1870s. And patients, hundreds of patients would come here to receive a dose of electricity from a medical battery, or they could even immerse themselves in electric baths. So this is just one example of the huge proliferation of medical instruments in the 19th century, so that by the early 20th century, really any clinical encounter is going to include at least one technology, and probably many. Historians often point to the invention of the stethoscope in 1816 as the beginning of this trend. A French doctor named René Laennec wanted to be able to hear some breath sounds of a younger female patient, and to avoid the awkwardness of having to put his ear right up against her chest, he instead rolled up a piece of paper. And you can see the first stethoscopes were really just rolled hollow wooden tubes. And here's an ophthalmoscope from 1850, and this allowed doctors to see into the inner structures of the eye. This SPHYGMOgraph from 1860 provided a visual trace of a patient's pulse. So you've got a pen connected to a lever that's pressed in onto an artery on the wrist, and you can get this trace. The SPHYGMOMANOMETer, invented in 1876, offered a way to measure blood pressure. And here's one that probably looks a little more familiar, with a blood pressure cuff from the early 20th century. And then here's the technology that has occupied quite a bit of my attention over the last decade or so, and it's the one shown here. So the induction coil here, we no longer want it for a dose of electricity. Instead, it's going to provide high voltage to the vacuum tube here, which is going to produce X-rays directed down at the hand, and then we can get an X-ray image of the hand on a photographic plate. X-rays were discovered in 1895, and these new startling images began circulating almost right away. And as you can imagine, doctors were instantly intrigued by the possibilities. They could imagine being able to image fractures, to locate foreign objects like bullets. So this is all to say that medical practice over the 19th century became increasingly technological, with batteries, stethoscopes, ophthalmoscopes, blood pressure monitors, X-rays. And as a historian, I want to help make sense of how doctors and patients reacted to these new devices. So what changed about the nature of medical practice? And when we think about the impact of technologies in history, we're often drawn to stories that give these technologies quite a bit of agency. They show up as these important actors that cause major changes in human societies or behaviors. So I'm sure you've probably heard some of the following stories. The printing press caused the Reformation in Europe, or the pill caused the sexual revolution in the 20th century. And historians and philosophers of science and technology have called this kind of story technological determinism. So it's this idea that new technologies arise and they become these powerful agents of change. So we can ask the same kind of question about medical history. How did all of these new instruments transform medicine? And historians have given a number of answers. Instruments like the stethoscope reduced reliance on patient testimony. Doctors now have another and maybe more reliable source of evidence. Maybe these new technologies made medicine scientific by offering quantitative data like the blood pressure readings. They attracted paying patients to hospitals. Up until the early 20th century, hospitals had really been just the last resort for the very poorest in society. New instruments also fragmented medical understanding of the body. These tools tended to encourage specialization so that doctors now focused on one part of the body versus another. So these are all really powerful stories, but you might not be surprised that I want to offer just some complication to the idea that it was technology alone that caused these changes in medicine. So to do that, I'm going to share 3 stories from my research, and each story has one kind of medical technology as the main character. So X-rays for story 1 and 2, and then infant incubators for story 3. And for each of these stories, I'm going to argue that focusing on just the features of the technology itself is really not enough to help us understand how these technologies came to be incorporated into medical practice. Okay, so story number 1 is about X-ray safety. And so we can start with the fact that X-rays were undeniably dangerous. The promise of X-rays drew Americans into hospitals at an unprecedented rate in the early 20th century. But the dangers associated with X-rays were pretty well known. So these headlines from the 1920s can give you a sense of these dangers. So from the here from 1920, patient is killed by X-ray machine, receives fatal shock while photograph of jaw is being made in doctor's office. Says burns from X-ray were fatal. Widow sues doctors in hospital for death of husband. Deadly suffocating gas given off by 2 explosions of X-ray films, and an accompanying fire killed 100 persons in Cleveland Clinic today. Anyone walking into an X-ray room, patients, doctors, technicians, risked, as we can see here, electrocution, fire from tremendously flammable X-ray film, even blunt trauma from falling apparatus, but even more, they risked exposure to unwanted radiation. X-rays could produce these amazing images of the hidden body. And here we see a doctor using a device called a fluoroscope in the late 19th century. This offered an instantaneous X-ray image using a fluorescing screen. So you didn't have to wait to develop your X-ray film. X-rays were also used right away as a therapeutic agent. So here we have a woman in 1903 who's receiving X-ray therapy for cancer. But X-rays could also cause horrible burns, changes to the blood, and even new cancers. As soon as an X-ray tube was turned on, it transformed its surroundings into a toxic environment. And as you can see in these pictures, there wasn't really a lot done at first to try and protect against unwanted radiation. So you can see the X-ray bulb here is completely unshielded. And some parts of the patient's body do appear to be protected by lead sheets. And I think I can see what are probably lead-lined gloves. But in the previous picture, there's no shielding at all. So this doctor is receiving a full unwanted dose of X-rays along with his patient. one of the things that I've done in my own work is take a close look at the first American guidelines for safety in hospital X-ray rooms. And these were published by the National Bureau of Standards in 1931. And I look at the ways in which the people who developed and reacted to these guidelines envisioned the risks and responsibilities of different people walking into the room. So I'm thinking about the relationship of different social groups to this technology: patients, technicians, radiologists, whose bodies were all at risk of radiation. And then physicists, who were prominent members of the groups that drafted the guidelines, and manufacturers who created these machines. So this is some work that I've published as part of a book, Inevitably Toxic, that I edited with two colleagues at the Claremont colleges, Janet Brody at CGU and Brenda Sarathi, who was at Pittsburgh. And the book brings together case studies looking at the creation of many kinds of toxic spaces across the 20th century, including radioactive ships who were present at the Bikini nuclear tests and then brought back to the Bay Area, pesticides used by the US Forestry Service, my X-ray rooms. So when I think about the regulation of X-rays, I'm doing it within this wider history of toxicity. And as with many toxic agents, X-rays were not studied at first in controlled settings. So by the time the first safety regulations were developed, X-ray use had become routine in hospitals. This first handbook for X-ray safety was published in 1931, over 30 years after the discovery of X-rays. But this isn't because the dangers of X-rays were unknown. So here's King Edward visiting an exciting new safety X-ray cabinet at the London Hospital in 1910, a cabinet that saves the operator from the evils of X-rays. And historians have shown that public awareness of the dangers of X-rays developed really quickly. So by, at least by 1910 or so, doctors were aware of the harmful effects of X-rays, but they felt that they had these basically under control. They had lead shielding, they were taking care with maximum exposure times, they were using remedies for burns if necessary. And here's some of the protective equipment that doctors could buy in the early 20th century. So it was actually physicists who first sounded the alarm in the later 1910s. They discovered that many of these protective materials were actually pretty inadequate. And it was a physicist, Lauriston Taylor, who convened the first US committee on X-ray safety. And you can see from the members of this committee that half of them are physicists, despite being physicists being really a tiny fraction of the overall X-ray community. And not only were physicists prominent members of this American Safety Committee, but the guidelines that are really at the heart of this 1931 document, they rested on physics research into the impenetrability of different thicknesses of lead to different X-ray intensities. So we've got this chart that's kind of the star of the guidelines, and it gives the minimum equivalent thickness of lead deemed to be adequate protection for each corresponding voltage. So for instance, if the X-ray tube is operated at 200 kilovolts, you can see the lead shielding needs to offer protection equivalent to 4 millimeters of lead. So when tables like this were published in handbooks, it circulated everywhere, textbooks, journal articles, there wasn't really any justification given for these numbers. But the guidelines were often published in conjunction with physics research in a way that suggested that their rationalization really lay within the physics lab. The 2 millimeters of lead shielding that we see here, deemed safe for voltages up to 125 kilovolts, was based on an earlier set of British guidelines. And to scale that number up to higher voltages, we needed research into the absorption and transmission of X-rays. And this was the kind of work done by physicists. So here, for instance, is the result of research done by one of the leading British physicists, showing the reduction in the intensity of X-rays transmitted through different thicknesses of lead at different voltages. So I'll just point out one of these numbers. It's showing that for our 200 kilovolts and 4 millimeters of lead, we get a transmission of 0.00196% of the incoming X-rays, which is a comfortingly precise number, but leaves open the question of how this had been deemed to be physiologically safe. That step is not articulated in any of the published guidelines. And it turns out it's not articulated because it was really nothing more than a guess. So in recollection, so here's George Kay. He's one of the main British medical physicists at the time. And he remembers that the best that this British committee could do was try and translate into a specific recommendation, a sort of grand average of the protective measures which could be gleaned from the working conditions of a number of experienced radiologists who had escaped injury. So based on these observations of basically just what seemed to be working, this is how they developed that first benchmark that 125 kilovolts needed 2 millimeters of lead. And this is what the US guidelines are based on. So despite that reassuring table of numbers that we were just looking at, neither doctors nor physicists actually knew what the practical difference was for operators who stood behind 2 millimeters versus 3 millimeters of lead. And that uncertainty is evident in a second layer of recommendations, which is a set of policies and procedures in addition to the lead shielding. So X-ray workers are warned protective gloves and aprons, even though in compliance with these recommendations, do not afford adequate protection. So care should be taken at all times not to expose the body unnecessarily. Radioscopic work should be performed in the shortest possible time. The doctor in charge needed to make sure that they were regularly checking the protective devices, that every worker wore an X-ray film badge periodically to check if the film was darkening at all, which would be evidence that the measures weren't adequate. And every worker needed to have routine blood work done every few months. So what I see in these 1931 guidelines is this tension between physics and medicine, between a completely standardized and quantifiable problem on the one hand, and on the other, a belief in idiosyncratic bodies and an acknowledgement of these deep uncertainties. The lead gloves and lead aprons that were stamped with a particular lead equivalency provided some comfort, but then the blood tests and the dental film all spoke to doubt about the reliability of the equipment and the possibility of personal susceptibility. And these uncertainties ultimately left responsibility for safety up to the doctors in charge of the X-ray room. And doctors' reactions to these new guidelines were pretty mixed. Some saw the necessity, but many instinctively just resisted any rule that might guide their behavior. They were adamant that they had to follow their own judgment. And one recommendation that received quite a bit of criticism was the idea that there should be an automatic timer that would shut off the X-ray apparatus after a certain dose had been given to an area of the patient. And so here we have Dr. Newell saying that this is basically useless because the machine will just shut off for every patient. It will only teach radiologists to ignore the warning. This is a matter in which I don't see how one can make a mechanical substitute for care on the part of the radiologist. And one of the primary reasons that doctors were really so reluctant to substitute their professional judgment for any kind of mechanism or shorthand rule was this continued belief in idiosyncratic bodies. So in one of the discussions following the publication of these guidelines, one doctor asked another what he considered to be the maximum safe dose. And the reply was, well, it varies so much with different individuals and different skins that, as you know, what will produce an erythema, which was a reddening of the skin with one, will not with the other. And so doctors really resisted set guidelines in favor of their own personal knowledge about their patients. But this also meant that of all the bodies in the X-ray room, patients had the least voice, and they were wholly dependent on the clinical judgment of the doctor. They're almost entirely absent from the guidelines. The only attempt to protect patients receiving diagnostic X-rays was that recommendation about the automatic timer, and we've seen that was rejected. There was no attempt in the guidelines to address patient safety for patients who were receiving therapeutic X-rays. And in fact, doctors wanted to educate the public so that they didn't sue on the first sight of reddened skin. One doctor on the committee argued that patients needed to understand first that the X-ray is potent, and second, that a reddened skin may be the necessary price of sufficient treatment. So the only agency that the patient really had in this space was as a potential source of dangerous secondary radiation. When an X-ray tube is on, the primary X-rays emitted can hit other surfaces, like the body of the patient, and actually create secondary X-rays. And this is evident in Taylor's handwritten note on the draft of the guidelines, which says we might need more protection for radiation from the patient. Okay, so what do I see in this story? Well, I think the simple fact that X-rays were dangerous doesn't really do much to help us understand the impact that X-rays had on medicine. So we've seen that physicists and doctors each had a very different understanding of safety. The quantitative guidelines about lead shielding created by physicists put an emphasis on particular kinds of equipment to keep people safe and seem to maybe make assumptions about standardized bodies. But they also hid deep uncertainty about the actual health effects of radiation. And so we've seen doctors really resisted these guidelines. They affirmed their own clinical judgment and their responsibility for safety. And we've seen that the judgment of risk depended on who was in the X-ray room. X-ray workers, technicians, doctors are visible in these guidelines in a way that the patients just aren't. Okay, that brings us to story 2, which is another story about X-rays. This one's going to take us into dental offices in the same period, the early 1930s. And here we're going to see that the amazing power of X-rays to reveal things like cavities was not enough to actually persuade dentists to buy X-ray machines. So this is a pretty recent project that I just finished, looking at the way X-ray equipment was advertised to dentists. And it was advertised by invoking expectations about how X-rays would appeal to a certain kind of dental patient. And this work's going to be published soon, I hope, in a book with University of Manchester Press, along with work by other historians of medicine examining patients as consumers and the role played by medical technology. And it came out of this workshop hosted at McGill in 2021. So some dentists did start experimenting with X-rays right away in the late 1890s. But overall, this technology took longer to become a standard feature of dental offices compared to doctors' offices or hospitals. And we can really see that in advertisements in dental journals in the 1920s. Here's one that's hoping to persuade dentists to splurge on some X-ray equipment, which would be a Christmas present to themselves. So X-rays were a bit of an indulgence, but not yet a crucial element of dental care. And in the 1930s, it was even harder to persuade dentists to adopt this technology. Many practices had been hit hard by the Depression, and equipment sold by Ritter X-ray Company, based out of New York, cost about $1,000 at the time, which is equivalent to about $20,000 today. So it's not surprising that a survey from 1930 showed that only about half, actually a little bit less than half, of graduating dentists purchased an X-ray machine when they were setting up their first office. So salespeople who were trying to encourage dentists to buy this equipment had their work cut out for them. They were told that the ability to size up and approach a dentist as a buyer is useful in determining how to open the interview, how to get under his skin, you might say. So that I found this great training manual from Ritter, training their salespeople, and they generated a list of 25 common objections that salespeople might hear from dentists who are unsure about buying an X-ray machine. So this might include dentists appealing to their bad finances, wanting to wait to have cash to purchase the equipment, wanting to get married first. Or you can see from number 8, they might just say, I don't want an X-ray machine. So salespeople were told to make promises about the positive impression that X-ray equipment would make on paying customers who would be newly attracted to the dentist's practice and willing to pay for X-rays. and also pay, excuse me, also pay for any necessary dental procedures that might be revealed by the x-rays. So in this project, I really wanted to uncover the characteristics of this imagined patient reflected in the advertising. And what I find is an expected consumer who would be educated enough to demand modern dental technique, but not enough to actually evaluate the skill of the dentist. So within that space, X-ray technology was expected to function as this powerful symbol of modern scientific dentistry. And then I also moved past the advertising to look at the actual design of dental X-ray machines. And when I do that, I find that there's this really interesting contrast between the way the patient was expected to see the dentist as this expert creator of X-ray images. But when we look at the actual practice of dental radiography, the equipment seems to take many decisions out of the hands of the dentists. And they were assured that actually you don't need much skill or knowledge to operate the machines. So this is really different from the story I just told about the doctor's relationship to this same technology. Okay, so let's start with expectations about these imagined patients. So in the 1930s, professional dental care was really still a luxury for most people. And a display of white, healthy teeth represented a path to upward class mobility. And X-ray companies promised dentists that their equipment would signal wealth and high social class and attract patients who were either already wealthy or willing to pay to achieve this social uplift. And we can see the pearl necklace on the patient in this picture. Not so subtly, X-ray salespeople were coached to praise dentists on that little touch of refinement in their office, betting that their patients have noticed the change. They promised doctors or dentists that by the introduction of X-ray work into your practice, you will find that you will unearth a higher class of work, which will enable you to eliminate undesirables from your practice. Without an X-ray, the better class in the community will avoid your office. The better class is never explicitly described, but you're going to see from the images of model patients and dentists in my slides that there's a pervasive expectation of whiteness throughout the ads. And in fact, in this period, it was very difficult. There was an overall national dentist shortage, but then in addition, it was extra difficult for families of color to find a dentist. And the number of African-American dentists from 1930 to 1940 actually declined. Companies further aligned dentists with their anticipated patients by acknowledging dentists' own desire for financial security. So in one short story that shows up in this training package, a fictional Dr. Colby is finally able to buy Mrs. Colby a fur coat, thanks to the successful installation of a Ritter X-ray machine. So in order to achieve this promised social uplift through dental care, the imagined patient wanted modern, progressive dentistry. And many ads emphasize the power of their equipment to create that impression. Frequent use of the X-ray is one of the ways by which the public is learning to distinguish the progressive dentist. Dentists were told that the public expected these visual displays of scientific equipment and dress. A dentist is accepted by his patients as being as modern as his surroundings indicate. And so the X-ray machine, even if it's not turned on, is operating as part of this scientific performance, and it's a testament to the skill of the dentist. Okay, so in these ads then, these ads aimed at dentists, there's this image of a patient who is expected to be a discerning and demanding consumer, able to choose a dentist based on the impression of modernity, science, and skill that's projected by the X-ray equipment. But now I'm going to show you that the actual design of dental X-ray machines promise to take most of the decisions out of the hands of the dentist. So here's Ritter promising that because of all of the fixed and stable factors of operation, The resulting X-ray images are never too light or too dark. They're always the proper density. And one prominent feature of a number of dental X-ray machines is this automatic timer. So exactly the thing that we saw the doctors rejecting. And Ritter promised that this would eliminate all guesswork for dentists. Dentists could just rotate the dial on the timer to the desired length of exposure, and the machine would turn off automatically. So here we're looking at a close-up of the Victor X-ray automatic timer. And on the back, there's this handy chart for reference. So dentists can look up the time of exposure that they need based on the area of the mouth that they want to X-ray, the age of their patient, and the kind of X-ray film. And then it'll tell them exactly how many seconds or minutes of exposure. And then for every area of the mouth, there's another column that offers a recommended angle for the X-ray tube. This one promises that there's no need to hire a specially trained graduate or specialist to help, because there are no mysterious or cumbersome adjustments. Everything is charted. All that's necessary is to follow this simple routine. And dentists don't even need to memorize any of these exposure times or angles, because the charts are printed everywhere on the timer and on other parts of the machine. So while the companies then are promising that patients would experience getting an X-ray as proof of a dentist's special expertise, the design of the technology required not very much from our dentists. And there's a similar disconnect between the agency of this imagined discerning patient as a consumer, and then the passivity and trust expected of the patients once they sit down to be X-rayed. Ads and manuals for dental machines are filled with these kinds of images of patients sitting motionless for their X-rays, holding their head in just the right way. And of course, the extent of this necessary trust is highlighted even more when we consider issues of safety. Dentists were assured by Ritter that there's absolutely no danger in the use of a Ritter shock-proof X-ray unit. And even in the name, you can see there's this attention to electrical rather than radiation safety. I haven't seen any advice for dentists about calming their fears of the patients who might be worried about X-ray exposure. And in fact, following a common theme from story one, the safety of the patients seems to be all but disregarded. Dentists are assured about their own safety, since the actual exposures are really confined to the patient who becomes the absorbing medium. And by this time, doctors had developed multiple kinds of practices for measuring a dose of X-rays that they were giving to their patient, but I haven't seen anything equivalent here. Dentists are just being asked to trust the manufacturers that the dose to the patients is appropriate and that the safety precautions are adequate. So these patients are being asked to put their trust in the dentist, and the dentist is being asked to just put their trust in the machine. So this is a really different situation than what we saw in medicine, where doctors resisted these standardized methods and refused to place their trust in lead shielding. So what are some key takeaways from story two? Well, I think the diagnostic power of X-rays didn't make their adoption into dentistry inevitable. Companies had to work hard to persuade dentists by invoking this particular desired customer. And dentists expected patients to see the X-ray as evidence of scientific dentistry and skill, but then the machines demanded very little expertise or judgment. Okay, that brings us to our third and final story. And this is a very new project looking at a different technology, incubators for premature or weak infants. And I'm just going to describe some of my early findings, and then I'm very curious to hear what kind of questions you have for me. So here is the new object of my attention in one of its first forms, designed by the French physician Etienne Tarnier in the 1880s. And really one primary goal of the incubator is temperature regulation for very small infants. So in this design, air is coming in through the bottom, and then it's circulating around these hot water bottles, and then rising by convection around the infant, and then exiting through the top. And this technology arrived in the US pretty soon after it was invented. It showed up in hospitals and at fairs and exhibitions by 1900. You may have heard of the famous incubator exhibits on Coney Island that persisted into the 1940s. Here we're looking at an incubator exhibit at the Louisiana Purchase Exhibition that ran for several months in 1904 and 1905. And the supervising physician, John Zahorsky, acknowledged that there were some concerns that these exhibits might sacrifice proper care for entertainment. For instance, contagion was a really big problem. You can see here initially the babies weren't separated from the visitors by anything more than a railing. And so when Zahorsky took over, he put up a glass wall, a window, so that the air from the visitors was not mixing with the air for the babies, which was necessary because before he did that, there was a really bad outbreak of diarrhea among the babies, and a number of them died. So, you know, despite these risks, Zahorsky still defended these exhibitions. He argued that the displays helped increase public awareness of prematurity, and might even encourage doctors to save babies that they otherwise might think were hopeless cases. Incubators started to move more consistently out of these kind of fairs and exhibits and into hospitals in the 1930s and 40s. And since then, this technology has really been the crucial intervention into the problem of prematurity, which is still a leading cause of infant mortality. But recently, a number of scholars and healthcare workers have criticized this narrow focus on one kind of technological intervention, especially given the continued racial disparities in both preterm birth and infant death. So according to CDC figures for 2019, infant mortality for Black babies in the US was more than double the rate for white babies. And the rate of preterm birth in African American women was 50% higher than the rate among white or Hispanic women. So incubators are a crucial element of care, but they don't prevent premature births, and they don't address the underlying social and economic causes of prematurity. So my project as a historian is to try and understand how this technology came to be so central to prenatal care, or to neonatal care. And so to do this, I'm trying to understand what was the perceived promise of this technology. So I'm going to talk quickly about a couple of the promises that I think were embodied here. And then I'm going to talk about how these promises were really only meant for white babies. So part of the allure of the incubator was the way it was seen to be a mechanical replacement for the uterus, an organ that was often seen to be delicate or faulty. So as historian Jeffrey Baker has argued, this technology seemed to provide an answer to the uterus. And here's one designed by an American doctor named Thomas Roch. And this one was totally enclosed. It even had a scale on the inside, so you didn't ever have to even remove the baby to weigh it. The incubator also seemed to stand in and maybe even improve upon the care of a parent. Keeping a new baby enclosed in an incubator discouraged breastfeeding, and so artificial formula was an important extension of this technology. Some doctors argued that keeping the baby isolated kept them safe from mothers who might handle the baby too much. But not everyone agreed that the incubator was better. So I found this short novel called The Incubator Baby from 1906. And this is actually pretty critical of incubators as a stand-in for parents, since they are, for instance, not adept at kissing. It has the potential to create this harmful distance between a parent and a child. These promises of the incubator as an artificial womb or an artificial mother embody a particular kind of knowledge or really ignorance of gendered bodies and care. But it's also a story, I think, of racial injustice. These devices had the potential to be anti-eugenic devices at a time when eugenics was flourishing in the United States, allowing so-called weak infants to survive. But sadly, that is not the story that I'm finding. And instead, I'm pretty sure that this story is going to be a contribution to a growing body of literature showing how medical technologies have been racialized and wielded to uphold white supremacy in the US. So I'll just end with a couple of these things that I've found as I've traced this story. So the first, as I said, is that really it's only white babies that seem visible in any of my medical or popular texts that I'm looking at. So incubator baby starts with storks in a garden of paradise, looking for a sweet pink and white baby ready to be carried away. And then I can show you many pictures of babies from, here's a pamphlet from the US Department, the Children's Bureau. This one is a depiction of motherhood from a British artificial milk company, Cow and Gate. And they actually included lots of pictures of premature babies who had successfully, taken their formula and thrived. And when you look at some of the main medical texts from the period, there's just no attention to potential differences in prematurity by race. This one, which is pretty famous from 1922, just has one mention of human race. So it's not really until the late 1930s that there seems to be some medical attention to the fact that rates of premature birth are not the same in different communities. So this one from Johns Hopkins shows the rate of prematurity is about double for non-white babies. And then this other one from 1949 has statistics, they say, from half the hospitals in the US. And they've got the rates slightly lower, but still a pretty big gap in the prematurity rates. But just at the same time, when we see this attention to these different rates of prematurity, we see this a number of attempts to erase that difference. So here's a group in Cincinnati in 1945, and they're arguing that we simply just need to lower the definition of prematurity for Black babies, that Black babies just have a lower average birth weight than white babies. So we shouldn't be alarmed. What looks like much higher rates of prematurity in Black communities is really just racial difference. Many Black babies that look premature are actually a healthy birth weight. And so they propose that we shift the cutoff and have this new cutoff of 2350 grams for Black babies and keep the 2500 gram cutoff for white babies. And when we make that difference, that adjustment, they note the racial differences just disappear. So I'm still working on tracing the impact of this argument, but I'm finding multiple references to this paper well into the 50s. So it seems that this argument didn't fade. And it's clear that this redefinition of healthy weight for premature Black infants had significant implications for the care they received, for whether they were even placed in an incubator, for decisions about feeding, whether they got a blood transfusion. So here we've got a pediatrician, Dr. Ethel Dunham, noting that the physician will have to decide in treating each case whether or not a Black infant at a given low weight is just more mature than a white infant of equal birth weight. And so here I think we can imagine how this ripples out into every single clinical decision, those in the moment judgment calls that can be so hard for historians to recover, where racist assumptions about infant development or experiences of pain or lung capacity impact the medical care that's being given to racialized patients. So as higher preterm birth rates in Black communities became medically visible in the 30s and 40s, what could have been evidence of the health effects of racism in American society was deployed instead to provide further evidence of the biological reality of race. And part of my goal in this project is to critique this promise of the technology as the stand-in for the uterus and for the mother. But that critique can stand alongside the fact that doctors reported great success in improving infant mortality using these devices. So it makes what I've shown here today, I think, really all the more horrifying that doctors were manipulating these definitions of prematurity in a way that directly impacted the chance of survival of these babies. So I hope what I've shown overall is that it's really difficult to anticipate the impact of new technology if we only look at the material features of that technology. Yes, X-rays were dangerous. They were pretty fantastic in their ability to reveal hidden parts of the body. Incubators were great at keeping small babies warm. But knowing all of that doesn't tell us what's going to happen next. We have to understand these wider social dynamics, different disciplinary values in physics versus medicine, the economic pressures faced by dentists during the Depression, the way gendered bodies are perceived, expectations about the biological reality of race. And once you see them, you are going to see declarations of technological determinism everywhere. So here is a very recent headline telling us that ChatGPT will forever change healthcare. And I hope that the history that I've shared with you today is going to make you just a little more critical of these claims that give all the agency to the technology. Technologies are social objects. They are always going to embody and also respond to social expectations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Vivien. Really appreciate your time here today. If we have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A. My first question for you, can you discuss the use of radiation on eczema in the 1940s?
Yeah, so skin issues was one of actually the first kinds of things that doctors use therapeutic X-rays for, because, you know, what's kind of fascinating is that the idea that X-rays might have this therapeutic power came about because people started to report that they were getting reddened skin and burns and hair loss. And so doctors saw that and thought, oh, well, maybe, you know, they can have this power that could heal various skin conditions. So I know for sure that doctors were using X-rays to try and treat things like eczema, ringworm, other kinds of skin issues in the early 20th century. I have to admit, I'm not 100% sure what that looked like in the 1940s and whether there was maybe other kinds of therapies at the time.
Great, thank you. Our next question, how do the 1931 safety guidelines compare to current standards?
Oh, that's a really good question. You know, I would have to take a look. I haven't looked at that in a while to see what the difference might be. I know one of the things that tends to be the same, or I mean, it's one of the things that certainly continues to be controversial is the question of whether there is indeed a safe threshold dose. So some sort of minimum dose of X-rays that is safe for the body. And that is something that's kind of built into those first guidelines. And by the late 1930s, doctors had decided on this particular amount of X-rays that was a safe dose of X-rays per day for a person. So the units are different from the 30s and now. And so I'm not sure, I don't think I've done the conversion to see exactly, you know, whether our new guidelines have lowered that dose. I would expect that they have, just because lots of research has happened in the intervening period about the effect of radiation on, you know, reproductive cells and things like that. But I think one of the things that's continuous is this idea that there is a minimum dose that's safe. And that's something that, as I said, some people are quite critical of.
Got it, thank you. Let's see, when were fluoroscopes banned and why? I remember fluoroscopes for shoe fitting in the early 1950s.
Yeah, so that is, that's one of those ones where there are, it's not an easy story. So I don't know who asked this question. It's funny because it's a webinar, so I can't see anybody, but I actually, there's been some historical work done exactly on those shoe fluoroscopes to trace the regulatory history. And it's one of those things where, you know, you get some regulation banning them, but of course they don't disappear overnight. So they were used in department stores, as you say, my understanding is well into the 1940s. And I've seen some. I went and saw one in a museum. And I think one of the things I find most horrifying about these, so for anyone who hasn't seen one, basically they're in a department store, you're trying on a shoe, and now you can put your foot in the shoe into this fluoroscope and look down to see where, the edge of your toes and the edge of your foot is in relation to the shoe. But all they have on the one that I saw was off, low, and high. No sense of what that means in any quantitative sense of like how much of a dose of x-rays you're actually receiving. So yeah, these were definitely not the safest, but persisted for quite a while. I think people really liked, right from the start, the x-rays showed up in all these sorts of more entertainment kind of spaces. People really wanted to be able to see their bones, it was kind of fascinating.
Thank you. Where can we see some of these historical medical devices? Do you have any museum suggestions?
Oh yeah, so for a while, and I haven't checked yet to see if it's still there, there's actually a small medical museum at the Western University of Health Sciences, just in Pomona here. I don't know if it's open. I haven't checked since the pandemic to see if it's still open for visitors. Certainly, the Science Museum in London is absolutely fantastic. That's a bit farther afield. I'm trying to think. There's a really great healthcare museum in Kingston, Ontario, of all places, also probably not quick to get to from here, but you'll often find at least one sort of exhibit of older medical machines in like American history museums. I was at the Smithsonian this summer doing archive research, and the National Museum of American History actually has has some really nice stuff on display.
Thank you. Someone mentioned International Museum of Surgical Science in Chicago has some neat objects. So
that's cool. I haven't been to that one. Thank you.
Our next question, were there differences in the quality of equipment, either X-ray or incubators, sold to doctors treating different economic classes early in their genesis?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. At the beginning, I think X-rays were so widely adopted because they weren't that expensive. So, comparatively, so at least for a doctor, now it's interesting, that it became economically prohibitive for dentists. But in the beginning, you really just needed a source of high voltage electricity and an X-ray, like a vacuum tube. So I don't have a sense. I've looked at a lot of catalogs for these devices, and I would say that you can certainly buy more complete setups that include maybe a little more control over some of the electrical variables. But I don't know that I got a sense that it's different in quality so much. But certainly there are definitely different price points in the catalogs. But I don't know, it's so hard to trace like who bought what. That's the kind of thing that's just not present in the historical record. I have the catalog, but then I don't really know which ones of these sold and sold to whom.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we're coming up on our hour, so our last question, let's see. Oh, okay, so just an update from an internet search, the Southern California Medical Museum is permanently closed.
That's too bad. Thank you.
So in the early 1900s, medicine changed from spas and sanitariums to hospitals. Did sanitariums bring in X-ray since they had all kinds of electromechanical devices?
Oh yeah, so definitely there's a period, and this really varies depending on where you're talking about, but certainly there's a period where you get an overlap, that the doctors who were in charge of these electric sanatoriums were also the ones who they had the equipment ready to be able to power an X-ray tube. I can't think of an exact example in my mind. I think I've mostly studied folks who are working in a hospital environment. It makes me think more of the radium institutes, which also sprang up in the early 20th century. And those were often very specialized, offering radium treatment. But yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that I have an exact example in my mind of a sanatorium that offered X-ray therapy in addition to electricity, but it doesn't sound impossible to me.
Thank you. Okay, so I think this could be a quick question.
Okay.
When were the dental X-ray machines first tested for dosage?
Oh, yeah. So that is an excellent unanswered question. So I am surprised because this is like a really new project that I just finished. I was really surprised that they didn't even invite a dentist to be part of that X-ray safety committee. So there's no dentist who helped create those guidelines. And I've only looked at the 1931 situation. They revised them again in the 40s. And so that's like to be continued. I will figure that out because I agree I don't know when that happened.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Vivien, I want to thank you for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. Thank you to our audience for your questions and for attending this event. We will follow up within the next week with a recorded video. Up next on Talks, we have Yin and Yang, perspectives of two women STEM leaders from academic and industry with Kathy French, class of 97, and Liz Orwin, class of 95, on Thursday, March 9th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. If you're interested in being a Mudd Talks speaker, please contact us at alumni@hmc.edu. All future events can be found on our website, alumni.hmc.edu. Have a great night and see you next time, everyone.
Thank you.